Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Welcome to another show. Today with me is Megan Griffith, and Megan is a professional blogger over at healingunscripted.com. She writes about all of the complicated realities of trauma and mental illness and the healing power of validation and community. Her goal is to help women everywhere realize that they aren't broken or defective or somehow inherently wrong. She wants to make everyone feel okay in their own skin exactly as they are. When she's not blogging, you can usually find Megan dyeing her hair, drinking coffee, or playing with her 1-year-old son. So welcome, Megan.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you. I love to dye my hair and drink coffee too.
Well, there you go.
I don't have the 1-year-old, but I got 2 out of 3 there. So today on the show, we're going to talk about, well, obviously trauma, but we're talking about trauma in a different way. And Megan calls it little t trauma. So Megan, why don't you kick us off and tell us what little t trauma means?
Sure. So it's usually a little easier to define little t trauma if we start with big T trauma. Sure. So big T trauma is what most people would naturally think of when they think of trauma. So maybe war, combat, or sexual assault, particularly bad car crash. Those things are big T traumas. Generally, big T can be defined by it's life-threatening in a very visceral, literal way. Little t trauma it doesn't necessarily threaten your life. It threatens other things. It threatens your identity. It threatens your safety, your sense of self. And these little t traumas can look like all kinds of things. Invalidation as a kid, childhood emotional neglect, gaslighting at work, being yelled at by your boss, having a teacher who bullies you. I mean, that could be big T trauma too, depending on how severe it is. But so these little T traumas can affect us in a really profound way. And because we don't think of them as traumas, we tend to downplay them. And so we don't deal with them. And so that makes them even worse. That is little T trauma.
So these are the things that can happen to us on a day-to-day basis that oftentimes we shrug off and, try not to exacerbate them and blow them up into something that quote unquote, we think they're not. When the fact is, it is trauma. It is very traumatic to be belittled by somebody or bullied by somebody, and they're not something that we need to downplay. But why do you think we do that?
Well, there's probably a couple reasons. The one that comes to mind for me is it was taught to us, right? So our parents maybe had their own little T traumas and they weren't taught how to deal with it. And so they never dealt with their own. And so they don't want you to deal with yours because in order for them to survive their trauma, they had to pretend it wasn't.
Right.
So they want you to do the same because that's the only way they know how to cope.
Okay.
I think that's the biggest thing that comes to mind for me. It's just a generational, not even generational,
it's intergenerational trauma.
Intergenerational. There we go.
Yeah. Intergenerational trauma. Okay. That makes sense. It's just kind of something that's coping skills that are passed down from one generation to another.
Yeah, that, and I think for some people, these things aren't traumatic, and that's okay too. Like, everybody's different. Everybody processes these events differently.
Absolutely.
You can have people, some war veterans don't have PTSD. They come back and they're okay. or people can get in really bad car accidents and they're okay. And there's a lot of reasons some people develop trauma and others don't. A lot of it just comes down to brain chemistry. It can't really be helped. So I think that's probably part of it too. The same with little t trauma.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with you, listeners. If you do have little t trauma, it doesn't mean that you're oversensitive or that there's something broken inside that you feel traumatized by something that may seem small to somebody else. Our vision and our feeling of trauma or our perception of trauma is unique. And it's not a cookie cutter thing. Mm-hmm. So, I want to make sure that our listeners realize that this isn't cookie cutter. Trauma's not cookie cutter. It's, I'm going to stop saying that now. I got stuck on that word. Anyway, it's very unique. Just like our healing journeys are very personal and very unique, how we view trauma is as well, correct? Wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And I've actually heard some people say that they don't love having it referred to as little t trauma because that, sort of diminishes it. And I can understand that. I've heard some people instead just call it complex trauma, which is really what it is. So that might be another way to think about it.
Okay. When I think of complex trauma, I think of, definitely childhood trauma, starting in our younger formative years and growing with us.
Yeah, that's the big thing about trauma right now in this very specific time that we're in. We don't have the official vocabulary for it the way that we do for a lot of other mental health issues. So there's this idea of developmental trauma, which is, complex trauma in childhood. There's this idea that complex trauma could exist at any age, but we don't really have diagnoses or terms for it because it's, it hasn't been made. Like complex PTSD isn't an official diagnosis yet, even though it's pretty widely accepted.
Right. We're still in that discovery phase of, what exactly is trauma and how does it affect people and why does it affect you different than me or, me different than Susan down the road. We're still very, very new in this area of the brain.
Yeah. And I think in our society, the way it runs right now, there's a lot of things that are inherently traumatic that I think psychology is just catching up to because it is so big and so widespread that it almost feels like you can't call it a disorder because everybody is being exposed to these traumas just by the nature of living in our society. So I think that's part of the struggle too.
Right. And, and I think because we're just now uncovering all of this and entering this realm, a lot of things are being misdiagnosed.
Oh, absolutely.
So, people they don't get to address what has actually happened to them. I know that for me, personally, I've had, I've been not diagnosed, can't diagnose love addiction, but I do have a love addiction. I have food addiction. But when I really start to dig into where these addictions came from and why I have such an addictive personality, part of it is hereditary. Mm-hmm. And then part of it stems from childhood trauma. And it was childhood stuff that I didn't even consider was traumatic. Like when my parents got divorced when I was 5, of course that would be traumatic to a 5-year-old, Of
course, but it's one of those things we downplay.
Yeah, exactly. We're like, oh, kids are resilient. They'll bounce back. And no, it affects us just as much as it affects everybody else.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For me personally, I completely...
Sorry. We're going to have a noisy podcast today between your baby and my dogs. It's all right. The listeners are used to hearing the dogs bark.
But for me personally, I was originally diagnosed with bipolar disorder because my mood swings were seen as, and I thought they were completely random, because I didn't think I had trauma. I had nothing big in my childhood ever happened. My parents are together, and in a lot of ways I had a very idyllic childhood. So I was like, oh, well, that can't be it. So these must be completely random mood swings. And yeah, that wasn't it at all. I had a lot of little T trauma in my past that I just didn't realize.
And I think little T trauma kind of snowballs. It's, it's not like with little T trauma, it's not like you've had one big, massive traumatic event. It's just all this little stuff that's kind of snowballed over the years and become this big, massive thing.
Yeah, it's sort of like death by a million cuts, right?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, what do we do? How do we heal from this?
I mean, that's such a big question. I think that's why a lot of people struggle, because it's such a big question. Like, how do you even start, especially when this sort of stuff gets hardwired into your brain, especially when it's childhood trauma? You learn from such a young age to be afraid or that you're wrong somehow, and trying to change that it's a lot. It can feel really overwhelming, but it definitely is possible. I think for me, the biggest key to healing has been validation. It's been just learning to accept the way that I feel, even if I don't like the way that I feel, and learning to accept the things that happened and that they count as trauma, even if I'm afraid that no one else would have been traumatized by it. That doesn't matter. I was. And so I'm trying to validate my experience, and through the blog, I'm trying to validate other people's experiences, because I know I'm not the only person who's in this boat.
Absolutely. And writing is a very powerful tool. We talk about journaling a lot on the show. It's just so powerful to be able to write and get those feelings out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, I love that you said validation and acceptance, because, that is something that I do teach is acceptance. You have to accept what happened to you. It happened. Whatever it was, it happened. There's no denying it. You didn't dream it. It happened.
And that is so much harder than it sounds. Like, there are days where I'm like, it wasn't really like that. I am exaggerating in my memory, and you start believing all the lies you were told, like, oh, right. I'm sensitive, I'm dramatic, I'm making this up. And you wouldn't think it would be so hard just to accept the truth, but it is difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, as we talk about a lot on the show, you have to move into the forgiveness side and forgive yourself for all the thoughts and emotions that you felt around whatever happened. And it's through that stage, actually, between forgiveness and letting go, for me, is when I start to really uncover the truth. So, for example, forgiving myself around having a food addiction and overeating. In doing that, I discovered that food was linked to my abandonment issues, which stemmed from my parents getting divorced and my thinking Dad didn't want me.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. But, sitting here thinking about it, I would have never just drawn that connection. It was through the actual healing work that it finally started. It was peeling the onion. Peeling the layers of the onion, that I was able to get to the root cause of some of these issues that I've dealt with. And, it's the same for anybody else on a healing journey. You have to peel back those layers. And some of them you'll find are interconnected, and you won't even know it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that catches me is you have to peel back the layers, and you have to keep going and accept what you find. So for me, I'm pretty self-aware, but I tend to use that as it's a trauma response for me, really. I'm like, how can I intellectualize this pain so I don't have to actually feel it? and I'll just be as aware as possible. I'll peel back those layers. I'm like, look at me, I'm making all this progress, but I'm never getting to the root of the problem because I am too scared to go there. So I just pull back layer after layer after layer, never making any progress.
Right.
So that's part of it, is being willing to accept what you find, whatever that may be.
And I think for a lot of people, they don't want to do the work because it's painful. It's hard. This is not an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination.
No, oh my goodness, this is tough stuff for real. And if anybody out there listening is doing this work, you're doing incredible, honestly. Even if you think you're struggling, even if you think you're doing it wrong, like just by doing this work and engaging, that by itself is incredible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just, for those of us who have those days where just getting out of bed is an accomplishment.
It is an accomplishment some days. It is. It's
kudos
good for you
when you hit those days and you manage to get out of bed. I mean, I've been doing healing work for years, and I'm still having days where, I'm out of bed, but that's about as far as I've gotten,
Yeah.
They're few and far between now, but I do
wonderful.
Still have those days, and I'm okay with that. I recognize now, okay, this is going to be a day of rest. This is a day that my subconscious, myself, whatever you want to call it, needs to heal and recover. And I don't beat myself up over it. The house is a mess. The dishes need washed. The dogs are barking like crazy. Whatever. Just let it happen.
Exactly.
You can wash the dishes later. Toss the dogs out in the backyard and let them go play. Life will be there when you're ready to deal with it again.
Exactly. And that's sort of the validation and acceptance I was talking about earlier too. Like, it can apply to the trauma itself, but it can also apply to the symptoms of your trauma. You can learn to validate your experience and accept where you are, even if you don't like it. You can be like, I hate that I have these limitations because of my past trauma, but I just do. And wanting it to be different isn't going to change it.
Yeah. You mentioned symptoms, and that's something that we don't talk a whole lot about, or we haven't talked a lot about on the show. So let's kind of do that a little bit. What are some of the symptoms of trauma, regarding, whether it's big T or little t? I mean, big T trauma is pretty obvious, but the little t trauma, there's a lot of symptoms that people don't necessarily realize.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think one of the big ones for me is you have trouble trusting yourself, right? Like, because you become the least reliable source of information when you go through invalidation and belittlement and gaslighting. Mm-hmm. You become the least reliable person in the room. And so you just don't trust yourself anymore about anything. So this can lead to all kinds of issues. One of the ones that flies under the radar, I think, is indecision. So like, I am terrible at making, even the smaller the decision, the harder it is, it seems like. And it's largely because I have no idea. I don't feel like I have agency, right, over my life. I'm not the one in charge, except I am. I just don't feel it.
Yeah, I tend to be the opposite and make rash decisions and then regret them. It's like, oh man, why did I do that? Why did I commit to going to that event when I know I'm going to back out of it?
So those are just two different interpretations of the same symptom.
Exactly.
Right? Issues making decisions.
Exactly. I know for me, some of my symptoms are, it's hard for me to focus.
Oh yeah.
It became really noticeable when my husband died. Obviously the first few months after his death, I was a mess anyway, but, here we are coming up on 2 years. God, I can't believe it's been almost 2 years. And I still have days where I struggle with focus and also memory. I have read that trauma survivors often have poor memory. And
yeah.
Let me tell you, my kids took advantage of that.
Oh my goodness. I bet. I cannot. I'm not looking forward to that part when my son gets old enough to take
Mom,
advantage
don't you
of that.
remember you said I could go to XYZ's house? No, I don't, but that doesn't mean anything. I probably did, so go ahead, And they'd be like, haha, we got away with it.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, to be honest, I don't know a ton about, I know that trauma and memory are very, very interconnected, but personally, I think my biggest issue is working memory. So retaining information while I'm processing it,
Right.
It just goes straight out the window. And I don't know what's up with that. I don't know why trauma has an effect on that, but I think it must.
Again, it's going to affect everybody differently. I have, honestly, almost no, very, very little memory of my past.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you a whole lot about what happened during high school, other than certain events that stuck out. Couldn't tell you what happened most of my 20s. I don't remember things. And it's frustrating because I want to.
Yeah, you want to feel like you've lived a full life, and that's hard when you have all these open spaces.
Yeah, it's like a computer. I'm going to get real technical here for a second, but it's like a computer that is fragmented. Mm-hmm. Remember the days we had to defrag our computers? It's like my brain needs defrag. You don't. Yeah, you're probably too young. My brain needs defrag. So, it's fragmented. It has all these open spaces, and you have to run the program to defrag it and, get rid of all those open spots and condense things. That's kind of how my brain feels. That I've just got all these open spots that I just need to close them up so that I have some sort of semblance of a life that I've lived.
And that's so interesting that you bring up the word fragmentation, because that is so often used when discussing trauma, because the sense of self gets fragmented, right? Because the definition of trauma is that you can't integrate it into your current reality, whatever thing that happened. And that's why accepting trauma can be so hard, because your brain automatically separates it like, nope, and puts it off to the side. So it's this whole separate event, separate from who you are as a person. And a lot of trauma work and healing is integrating who you are with what happened to you. And that can be really, really difficult.
It can be, absolutely. Well, this has been a great talk. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about this.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's not something that's often talked about, the difference between the bigger traumas and the little traumas. So it's good that we were able to really kind of define some of the smaller traumas. Not that they are any less significant than the bigger ones. It's just verbiage as far as how to define them, I guess.
Yeah, we're still working on that vocabulary.
We're still working on the vocabulary. Trauma is trauma. So yes. Thank you so much. And listeners, as always, thank you so much for listening in. And we will talk to you next week on the show.